Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we are going to be recapping the EUIC. I've just come back actually from London. It's not too far away from me, so it's not the worst, but I'm still pretty beat after commentating the tournament and having a blast. Honestly, this was, I think, possibly my favourite EUIC. Just the size of the tournament, over 1,500 players. It's basically doubling the size of previous EUIC's like highest amounts, so absolutely crazy to see so many people getting involved. And also, there was a lot to like. We have now rotated. This was our first E-On format with the introduction of Scarlet and Violet, and it did not disappoint. We have a real freshen up of the metagame. Yes, we're looking at Lugia, Lost Box, and Mew in our top 8. That was already pretty established, but we also have the introduction of Gardevoir and Miraidon, both making it into top 8, as well as Alex Szymanski, the eventual winner of the tournament, with a new Arceus counter toolbox, which was exceptional. Let's start there. So first of all, huge congratulations to Alex and Todd for making an amazing finals. Very memorable, very worth going back and watching. It was very tense and could have gone either way. Both of them had some awkward prize cards at different points, some awkward hands at different points. Very, very awesome to see. This decklist not only won the tournament, it also got 10th place as well as top 64 from a few people piloting it. So definitely a very strong archetype. I think we'd only really seen murmurs of this in like 1 or 2 online tournaments, but very, very few people were actually piloting anything similar to this. And there were even innovations from what we had seen in some of the Play Limitless tournaments that we've had previously. But this is the core concept. Arceus Vstar gets you in the game, powers up either Duraludon VMAX, which still has that annoying skyscraper ability for the Lugia matchup, as well as just being like a good wall breaker against Goodra and just high hit points and high enough damage output in multi-prize matchups. Then you have the 1-1 Alolan Vulpix V-Star, which of course we saw in the finals, because the Snow Mirage says your Vulpix cannot be hit by Pokemon that have abilities. So this was intentionally added into the deck to have a really good time into good old Gardevoir, which was obviously what he came up against in the finals. So this was somewhat a crucial card. It allowed Alex to win at least one of his 2 games, because in game 3 this was in the top right of the prize cards. It also does have its own V-Star power, which is also quite good against Mew, which I thought was quite interesting because Alex is also playing double Drapion. But that's just really having a huge nod to Drapion. You can't just Silvery Snowstar and rely on a Wild Style, because oftentimes you still need to have Starbirth just to get into the game, that you just feel a lot more confident if you just rely on Starbirth and double Drap instead. Obviously, you can power up Drapion with its Dark typing into Gardevoir as well, so not just in here for Mew, I suppose, as again we saw in the finals. Not going to spoil too much on that, but outside of this, we don't really see much of an engine around the deck. It's really just Starbirth, then rely on Supporter Draw for the remainder of the game. Aluminion definitely helps out here, cherry-picking some specific ones, and we do have the Radiant Gardevoir trying to make us that little bit more tanky into V Pokemon. I'm sure this is helpful against Giratina players, Arctina, and just Lost Zone Tina. I feel like that is very relevant. So it seems to be some really smart choices where you're trying to cover all sorts of bases with only really a handful of different attackers with Trinity Nova and Charge at your disposal. Heavy Research, heavy Chorus, still a good number of Judge and Boss. 1 Sharon's Care, 1 Raihan. Of course, you can try and cherry pick these from like Ultra Ball as well. So it's not just trying to Starbirth for these sorts of cards. You can also backdoor into them with Luminous Sign at some point in the game. Another really smart shout was Lost City. This seems very good against Lost Zone box players. Especially the Radiant Charizard build, where he came up against Pedro in top 4. And it was a Radiant Charizard build, so you completely deny the spam of a Charizard with the likes of Clara and whatnot. If you just lost City at once, they're pretty much out of valid attackers, and you have some very chunky Pokemon for them to get through without a Charizard, that's for sure. And then we have this split of energy required for the Vulpix and the Duraludon. So it seems to be a really nice combination of Pokemon. Arceus is continuing to do very well at the large tournaments. I feel like it was kind of under-respected going into the EUIC. I suppose the most popular build was Arctina going into the event, still with that Bibarel. But there was also murmurings of this deck and Arc Goodra and a few other different combinations of Arceus, and I feel like it still has a great place in this metagame where it still can be adapting cards in and out of the list based on what we're expecting to be, changing in popularity. And even though the cat's out the bag with Alolan Vulpix, I'm not really sure what Gardevoir can do to make things easier for that matchup. Possibly playing Escape Rope or even just an additional boss's orders when we look at towards 60, something like that could be added into the list, or just adding in additional memory skip rolls. But even then, memory skip is wasting a turn, and sometimes the Arceus player can just win a conventional prize race if the Gardevoir slows down for too many turns. So it seems to be a very well-rounded deck, and is definitely a new headache. I think Duraludon bursting onto the scene and making it all the way to the finals, and we'll also be looking at a lot of the Lugia lists, but we're also playing Dura. It's actually very scary for Lugia, and Lugia was very popular. It was the most popular deck in day 2, and it was the second most popular deck in day 1. And Duraludon is a very strong answer to Lugia, so I'm interested to see how Lugia chooses to adapt. Will it be adding in its own Duraludon, or will it now be converting to Rapid Strike Urshifu VMAX, Single Strike Urshifu VMAX, to have a one-blow option through these sorts of Pokemon? That's another debate to be had. There's going to be a lot of things having to change if we're going off of these results. Then we have Tord getting second place, and Robin Schultz playing the same 60 to top 32. So again, a great indication that this list was very powerful. And as we know, again, just a quick note on Tord, what a phenomenal player. Has now been in 6 finals of ICs, winning 4 of them. It's incredible how he's able to come back again with innovations on some of the best archetypes, and it feels like he's just made Gardevoir more consistent than most. Research was mostly just seen in V-Union builds of Gardevoir, but in this case we're seeing 4 copies with the Turbo approach. No Mirage Step, just refinements because trade is busted. Having Luminion as well to help you not just get to research yourself into the game. This actually really reminds me of when Tord was playing Lele Bridget in a Zoroark deck, because you knew that just getting your evolutions got you into the game. This feels very similar, where we have a ton of Ball Search, but then we have Luminion plus Research, and then hopefully off Researches we're hitting more VIPs, more Fog Crystals, that sort of thing, because as soon as that's got you into the game, you can then not only refinement throughout, but also you can throw away excess research that you no longer require, because you'll maintain a large hand size throughout, and you'll protect yourself that little bit from opponent's judge at the same time. So really great call on quad research. Of course, that leads you down the rabbit hole of having to play things like Power Pad for your other one-off supporters. Has Judge and Roxanne for disruption, has Worker to add to your stadium count for bouncing Path of the Peak, because of course you rely on your Psychic Embrace ability. Miriam, the only Pokemon recovery. I definitely prefer Miriam over Clara, always have in Guardi, because it's adding to your draw total, which is just exceptional. Penny, a really interesting one. I think you can try and lay some traps for Lost Zone box players by having this card in your deck. You can try and deny some rope plays at times, or you can just let something be a sponge in the opening stages, even if it is a Zacian or something, and you can penny up a Pokemon and sort of undo some cram math, or if they are setting up Sableye math, it can be detrimental to them. And of course, this is your way around Mawile. Mawile was that one-of tech card that was almost the worst kept secret going into the EUIC. I think there were murmurings, 2 or 3 weeks before the tournament about this card from many different testing groups from essentially across the world. And 1 or 2 days before the tournament, when I was there in London, the amount of questions I had of, Joe, do you have any spare Mawiles? My goodness, it felt like so many people would have played that this weekend thinking that it was kept under wraps enough to be good. But there were still a handful of players like Tords who had their finger on the pulse and wanted to respect that, which seems pretty strong. Just the one Boss's Orders is the biggest question mark about this deck, and I feel like if a lot of people test this deck and don't have the same restraint as Tord, I could definitely see a flip-flop of one research being cut for a Serena. Now, Serena can still be a panic draw option in the opening stages, but then would give you some prizing coverage, go watch the finals, as well as giving you that chance of having an additional Gust just in the deck. So I was definitely a big component of one boss and one or two Serena in the list. So adding in one, at least for my personal preference, seems like a really good choice. But you also can't disrespect the fact that research gets you into the game and has the biggest dig in the opening stages. From there, the stadium debate also seems to be mirroring the Japanese winning and successful lists, where we see Collapse Stadium and Temple of Sinnoh. Temple of Sinnoh, pretty relevant just for trying to make life a little bit more awkward for a handful of special energy decks, and of course the Collapse can be really helpful, seeing as there is a Luminion and double Zacian in this list. So the Penny Collapsed is kind of that soft combo that you're having for Lost Zone without really committing space to your deck list, because you already kind of need these cards anyway. You need to play a certain amount of stadiums, and Penny's like helping against Lost Box, whereas a lot of the time the conventional wisdom with these sorts of Gardevoir lists was to play Jelly, and they just took up their own spaces and they were essentially fodder in other matchups. Sometimes you could set up some math by like embracing a ton onto an Arcana Guardi and then letting it jelly up and then having it as a threat on your bench whilst you did other things. But overall, the jellies like aren't the strongest of cards, so going about the Lost Zone box matchup this way is like very space efficient and very intelligent. And I think when you're choosing to play double dog and one Gardevoir, it's a no-brainer to not play Champs Fest. I feel like if ever we do go back to double Shining Arcana, Champs Fest is still probably stronger than Sinnoh. That's still my suspicion, because it still helps you get to 300 that little bit more. And because we have just seen Alex's list playing Quad Lost City, I'm more inclined to make a space for Shining Arcana, which is something interesting. The other thing that I thought was super interesting was that they played 12 Psychic Energy rather than 11. 11 was pretty much the known quantity for Gardevoir since it came out in Japan, and it was like copy-pasted 11 all the way down. Like every list I'd seen was always on 11. And if you were making that additional space, it would often just be the extra Fog Crystal, because it would be an extra consistency card in the opening stages. But having that 12 gives you more prizing coverage and just more access in the opening turns for pop-off potential, essentially. You just want to see these as quickly as possible. So maybe a debate around Fog versus 12th, but this is, I think, mostly just a prize coverage style card. Or you can try and make plays, and your opponent, if they think you only play 11, they can make some like panic gust plays thinking that they have you, and then they just don't because you play that 12th energy. So maybe just sort of playing on people's list knowledge is also a reason why there was 12 Psychic in here. But I could also see this card becoming one of the slots that you change. I feel like for research, the statement's been made, but I feel like it could be 3 for Serena as one cut, and then possibly that 12 Psychic could either be Fog Crystal or second Arcana Guardi. Those are the sort of things that I'm thinking about developing this list as we go forward. I'm not taking anything away from this list. It was so far ahead of most other people's 60s. It was just so obvious whenever I saw this deck in action and how smoothly it was drawing and how many cards it got to see by turns 1 or 2. And it was in part thanks to this massive amount of research, but also the fish came in as well. And really just was so far and above the other engines that we'd seen in the past, like the Triple Judge, the 1 Arven, all this other stuff. Was just far weaker than just playing conventional discard draw 7. So yeah, exceptional deck list. A few notes there of how I think it could adapt going forward. But overall, really, really smart list. And of course, got to mention that Memory Skip was in here. This was in the very successful Champions League Aichi list, and actually if you look at the article from players in Japan, they were all saying they actually were respecting Alolan Vulpix at the time, so for Tor to carry on that was also like very clever, I suppose. And the 10 hit points shouldn't end up being too relevant unless you're getting completely trolled by Sableye like Echoing Horn plays. I feel like that's the only time it could be awkward, where you have like Ralts and Mew as 60 hit point mons they can bring back. But again, that's something you can try and manage. And if the Mew that you evolve into eventually is like your EX, sorry, the Ralts that you have that has Memory Skip eventually becomes the EX, it's like the most difficult thing for them to knock out anyway. So it shouldn't really be that big of a deal, right? That's kind of the thought process, that only having one 60 hit pointer isn't that bad. So let's move on to top 4, and again, just another shout out to some of these games. The Tord Pablo top 4 game was also a great one, worth watching back. And Pablo's playing, again, a really interesting list, playing no Lost City in Mew, and playing, very similar to some Japanese 60s, the Quad Vacuum, Quad Path build, and saying that rather than trying to Lost City Drapions, you're just going to try and re-establish Rock's Path instead, and say, if you hit your Clara, I got on lucky if I knock out this Drapion. But also knowing that if they're using a 2-prizer, then it then becomes an Echoing Horn target that could actually end up helping you later on in a prize race anyway, which is kind of interesting. And of course, Lost Vacuum is just a better declogging card than having additional stadium cards in the deck that have to be timed in certain moments. So Lost Vacuum can be this card that can help you just thin other things that you don't need in the deck list anyway, which was also pretty interesting to see. The Fan of Waves, kind of cool. It's a way of getting rid of V-Guard energy, so it can allow you to get closer into range, especially against Lugia, which seems pretty relevant. Also playing Avery in the deck list is kind of interesting. I'm not sure if this is a Mirror Tech card or if it's for anything else in particular, but it's adding to your overall support count. Sometimes you'd see a Silene in here, and that gives you more burst potential. Personally, I like that little crutch of Silene just for awkward prizing, especially just with 3 VMAX. I mean, 3 is the standard number, right? But again, you can get mugged off by awkward prize cards and such. And I feel like Silene is just that really great catch-all at times where you have those little bit of extra resources. You can make pushes in different ways by having it. So a small debate over Avery versus Silene. But at the end of the day, this is an additional draw card, and it probably was quite decent in the mirror as well. Also seeing no Oricorio in here, so not seeing the reason to want to math fix, and possibly just not even wanting to put this down in a number of matchups, because sometimes a 1-prize Pokemon helps the prize map of certainly Lost Box and a handful of other matchups. So if Pablo was expecting Lost Box to be super popular, seeing Oricorio as almost like a lost condition if you start with it means you don't want to play it in your deck list. So it also makes a ton of sense. Yeah, very, very strong list from Pablo, though. Overall, everything seems to make sense. I think the only question mark I would have is if ever we want to weave in a Silene, essentially. But overall, really, really strong. Then we have Pedro's Lost Zone Box deck. So Lost Zone Box was touted to be like the strongest archetype, and most people were on gate builds, right? This whole time I have been preaching that Charizard is there and just as powerful, and Pedro, of course, is one of the best players in the world, so no matter what he turns his hand to, he's got a good chance of going deep in the tournament, so I'm not having this gotcha moment with Charizard. But what I will say is that this is what essentially a lot of the CCG testing group ended up playing. Jack ended up playing a Charizard build that was like so similar to this list without actually having spoken to Pedro directly. This is what we were testing in the build up to the tournament. A list very, very similar to this 60. So a lot of good players was certainly playing Charizard as well as the Radiant Greninja, and it turned out that for this event at the very least, Charizard had the upper hand. Now, it has a terrible matchup into Shemansky's new list, so I think that could be a reason for you to be put off Charizard going forward. But for the EUIC, I thought this was a pretty strong list. The Pidgeot Forest Sealstone was intended to give you a decent time into the mirror match, as you could search out Pidgeot early with Nest and VIPs, etc. And then you're essentially wasting your opponent's use of Escape Rope, because then they would cram into a Pidgeot, and then as long as you move out the way, you can vanish that damage away. Whilst at the same time, of course, Forest Sealstone is just a consistency card. It's like having an additional Pokegear if you're looking for Colress, or it's, you know, allowing you to have VIP pass if you just have a Nest Ball or whatever in combination with this. So it just made some combos work, and it obviously works nicely with Pidgeot because it jumps back into the deck, so it's no longer a 2-prizer liability. But then you have the added upside that you cannot deck out, and that's where the second dimension of this deck starts coming together, where you see the Miltank and the Mawile. So Mawile, like I said, was this sort of underappreciated tech card, I guess. I mean, a lot of people saw this card in a few other online decks. I first saw it in Shadow Rider, but obviously this is a colorless attack cost, so this could be splashed into theoretically any deck. And the concept is, Lugia going into EUIC played no switch cards, and Gardevoir played no switch cards. This is going into the EUIC. From all the lists that we'd been seeing, again, from Japan and from most of the online tournaments. So why don't we just gust up if it's against Lugia, Radiant Serena, or a Luminion V, and Tempting Trap the entire game to win. Or if it's up against Gardevoir, tempting trap either things like Klefkis or whatever, or try and tempting trap, most notably Radiant Greninja, kind of the biggest one here, right? So you just stall the entire game is the idea, and you will Pidgeot back into the deck if ever you have less cards in deck whilst you establish that combo. So this combo is in theory live at every point in the game, because you can just, even if there are switching outs in some of these decks in low counts, if they just play through the game and have to get rid of them for, you know, research and what other things they need to do just to keep up in tempo, you can catch them out with the Mawile. And the Miltank, slightly less so about that Miracle Body ability, but it's there as a fallback. It's quite nice against things like Goodra, so something to bear in mind. But this is actually a Miltank, sorry, this is a Klefki killer. I should have mentioned that rather than saying you would Mawile trap a Klefki, because that won't work. But Miltank is a great way to attack into Klefki. That was why it was on the mind, because it attacks for 2 colorless, and nothing else in the deck has a way of touching Klefki early. And because typically Klefki decks are either going to be Shadow Rider or Gardevoir, or even Miraidon if you were expecting that, they all have to go wide, right? Because they need to, for it to be a problem, they need to already put 2 Klefkis down, because otherwise you have the outs to rope around it. And they need to then be building more things on the board. So naturally you can route through Klefki. So them attempting a Klefki against you is essentially pointless. This acts as your like Cramorant in the situation where you're up against Klefki. So Pedro definitely respecting that angle. Outside of that, the supporter line is quite interesting to me. Playing 2 copies of Boss's Orders may be leaning into the Mawile side of things, but I personally really still like Cross Switcher in the Charizard based build. I know you're much more likely to only get 1 Gust in the game that way round, and I know of course cross switchers take up more space, but it still feels to me like your late game is much more Clara focused, because you're just by virtue of being a Charizard deck. So I'm still a little surprised to see bosses in here. That's a personal thing. The Roxanne's also interesting as well. It's good obviously against Lost Zone box mirror match situations, but it also gives you weird panic situations where you can try and just Rocks and Lost Mine like their draw engine mons, if it's a barrel or something else like that, knock out an attacker and set up damage across the board and just try and put people in awkward positions. I feel like, again, because your late game is normally so strong with Charizard, it feels like right-handing and Clara-ing are your best options, so the Rocks is also kind of flexible, I think. Definitely like Echoing Horn. The gear count is very high. Typically you see like 2 copies of this as well, so Pedro just not wanting to whiff Colrus, which ironically is somehow what happened in this top 4 game. I mean, he was in a bad matchup against Szymanski, but you didn't even get to see his deck work at all. It was just very sad how bad his draws were throughout that game. But yeah, the Charizard looks quite unsafe going into the next few cups, I would say, because of Alex's win, and people obviously wanting to net deck the sort of counter approach to an extent. But a nod to Charizard, there could be moments in this meta where it's the better Lost Box to play. Aiden, again, having a great season, coming off of, well, jumping off the Eternatus train, obviously, thanks to rotation, and now moving on to Goodra. This is another interesting list. I was also a really big fan of Goodra. That was like the other deck on our testing table in the build-up to the tournament. And I'll be completely honest with you, I feel like I probably would have played Goodra if I went into the EUIC. It was definitely the thing I was enjoying the most in the final few days going into the tournament. And this is a pretty similar idea where you have a very streamlined Pokemon lineup. Double Drapion seems quite high for a deck that plays so few basics, but there's a general understanding that you're worried about not only Mew, but also Mewtwo v Union, perhaps. So wanting to have a Mirage Gate option onto Drapion is also kind of reasonable, I suppose. The supporter lineup, very reasonable. I'm surprised to not see a Raihan in here, adding to your total count, especially when you see so many one-offs. Like, Choice Belt is a really important one, especially against, like, Dragonite. And sometimes gives you the upside of gusting into certain things that haven't yet evolved. That can feel absolutely massive. The switch outs all seem pretty okay. There's the justification of maybe like 2 switch, 2 carts, but I wouldn't play any less switch, because obviously sometimes moving the Goodra is more important than the slight bit of heal you can sometimes get to offset Sable Math in like Lost Mirrors. The Ball Search is also kind of low. with only 2 Nest and 2 Ultra. I think oftentimes you'd see that flip-flop just for the extra Nests, just to get into the game. And I also actually really like playing No Recycler in Goo. I would just, again, think about this card becoming the Raihan, because you're really not that focused on Mirage Gates. Like, you really only need to use 1, and some games you will ignore this anyway, because you go for like an attachment Melanie route if you've like gone first, and you have Raihan as well, so I'm not high on the Recycler really. Also, the Crystal Cave is interesting. Definitely some of my friends were debating the secondary stadium being split with Beach Court. There was debate to Lost City in this deck. There was debate to Temple of Sinnoh in this deck as well, so you can knock out Tyranitar's more easily. And, of course, Crystal Cave is that sort of other in-between where, because your opponent is so aware of Moisture Star, they will do a poke that just does just enough to put them in range or to force that Moisture Star. Even if it is just like a little bit of Sable Sprinkle or something. So then having the Cave option means, I'm out of range without having to spend my Moisture Star. My opponent's been put back a turn, essentially. Which is also a very cheeky option, which is kind of cool. The one worry for Goodra is the amount of Duraludon VMAX sort of coming into the mix. Now, I know Duraludon hits a solid number that then allows you to Moisture Star, but you don't have any benefit of Rolling Iron. So I think that's a little bit awkward. And... yeah, but again, Goodra in top 8 and also bubbled out of another top 8 placement. So it could have been 2 Goodra in top 8. So just bear that in mind. It had done very well. Hermione also is a regional second placer with Goodra. So obviously a solid player with that archetype. Trevor played Lugia. And it looked like a lot of the American contingent in particular were all adding in the Duraludon line to Lugia. And this is certainly respecting mirror matches, right? Because the Duraludon just says no in the mirror, so it gives you a win condition immediately. It also gives you a way to wall break yourself, just in case anything was trying to do that. So that's also kind of cool. Had the 1 Yveltal as well as the T-Tar to give you that dark type coverage still, and gives you 2 single prizes to use. Does have the Serena and the Pumpkin. This list is not playing any switch outs, but interestingly it does play Thornton. So Thornton is kind of like that soft answer, where it's filling a few niches for you actually. It can allow you to get out of this Morwell lock, because you can then convert your Serena or your Luminion into a different Pokemon that obviously you can then power up and attack with, because these are the Pokemon that get stuck, right, by Morwell. So if you like discard and convert it into any of these single strikers, then you just hit them in the face and start taking prizes. But also, it allows you to have that like additional single prizer against Lost Box. It allows you that extra dark type attacker against Mew. It just kind of has to be timed well, and there'll be a number of games where it doesn't come off. So I can see the reason to like want to make the space and just cut this card, but I do think it seems reasonable enough if we're still respecting more while going forward, which, like, the cat's out of the bag, but there's still going to be that ongoing thing of like, oh, now that it's known, should we even tech for it? So there's going to be an ongoing debate throughout this format, whether or not we should, and I feel like to be safe, you probably should have something in your deck. I know Ian Robb played 1 copy of Escape Rope, and I feel like Rope has massive high roll potential as well, so that's another debate, whether or not you want Thornton or Rope. But I feel like the Thornton, even though it is taking up a space itself, it lets you almost cheat that space to fit the Dura in as well. Even makes this card more effective, so kind of cool overall. The ball search in the stadium count is kind of what we've seen. There's the debate over no Collapse Stadium. I feel like Collapse is really, really good. But I also understand that like the Dura obviously takes up some of these spots, and you can't reduce your consistency any more than you already have. And obviously, to incorporate the Duraludon, you need to go heavier on the single strike energies. The impacts come in as allowing you to attack with the Duraludon, and obviously helps Yveltal as well, because it's really hungry on darkness energy specifically. So this adds to your like earn count and just makes sure that you don't run out of single strike options. But it does mean you are quite light on the colorless options as well, so just be wary of that in case you are getting stuck in the active with like too many Lugias and such. Definitely be aware of those sorts of things from opponents. The other Lugia that made top 8 was Eric Rodriguez, and they've got a slightly different build. They are playing a thicker Duraludon here, and they have much less supporters, so no Serena in here. Just has the research and thick boss, and is actually playing Tower of Darkness. So with the higher count of Dura, and obviously impacts in here as well, and that third urn, you actually end up having quite a number of outs to draw off this. I'm also really surprised by a 3-2 Lugia line. It scares me so much. Like, we got away with 3-2 in the old format because we had guarantees on Quick Ball and Aroma, but now it just feels quite greedy to me. But hey, it made top 8, so what can I say, really? Have the 1 gift, 1 regenerative. I think gift is also just way better than 1 random copy of this card, to be honest with you. So it's definitely a different way of going about it, but I feel like there could be changes to this list for sure to be a little safer. And then to round out top 8 before looking at the overall metagame in day 2, we have Rob's list of Miraidon Regieleki. Now, Rob was on stream 3 times, bless him, and I know Rob personally, and I know that he's a player that gets quite nervous when on stream, actively like hates being on stream, and kind of gets in their own head and is almost flustered by the extra pressure. And I feel like we actually saw every loss and tie that Rob had on the stream, and off stream he was just killing it. He was just playing way better, and obviously performed insanely well with a new version of Miraidon in many ways, because it is actually just more aggressive than ever before. We're getting close to just a 2-line deck list, which you always love to see, and it's just very aggressive in the way that it's built, and it actually reminds me a lot of Mew, where we have the Crams as well as Echoing Horn, and just saying, this is a really good deck at winning in 3 attacks, let's try and do that. And Cram giving you the way into early generators, or just getting a combo piece here and there, is kind of better than having the sort of slower options of Arven at times, and possibly even Judge. Now, I did see Rob playing up against a Lost Zone player, and honestly, I think like 1 Judge could be fine in this deck, because you even play Forest Seal Stones to try and help you get there, just for at least a little bit of mid-game, like let me slow them down a bit. But take nothing away from Rob's list, it's really, really fast and efficient. I do love the double Raikou as well, seems really, really good, and not wanting to waste space on things like Klefki and whatnot also makes a ton of sense. So overall, really like Rob's list. I feel bad that we threw him on stream too many times, and it actively probably hurt his tournament overall. But that is, unfortunately, the way the cookie crumbles when you are suffering from success. But yeah, I expect Miraidon to still be very good in this format. It's still a really good pace setter. And with Lugia having to question lots of things, Gardevoir having to question things, Lost Zone Box and Goodra being like introduced into the format, these decks all have something new to think about. It feels like Miraidon's the deck that's just like, I'm Miraidon, I'm playing my game plan, how good was your opening hand, because if it's bad I'm going to rush you down. It's basically just another way. It reminds me of like a Meloetta Mew that's probably just more consistent than Meloetta Mew, and or even if they have similar consistency to Sparkle Mew, it's less easily countered than just being like, well, Drapion, see ya. So, yeah, I really like this aggro approach. I need to test way more of Rob's build. So there we are. Also in top 16, there was an Inteleon Urshifu. Very surprising to me, because I think this has a pretty poor matchup into Lugia. One thing that we do see, though, is the Drapion Vstar, which is very cool. Having the option to para-poison things. This could be a way of slowing down Lugia's, certainly, right? Because they played no switch cards, so you could try and trap something in the active and make some cheeky plays going on there. Outside of that, it's a pretty streamlined support account at the very least, which I like seeing. So yeah, cool stuff on that front. Also had the cheeky Echoing Horn play. There was a Guardy Mewtwo in top 16 as well, so there are multiple ways of doing well with Guardy. The Mewtwo is still pretty legit, and we saw Rune win in seniors with Guardy Mewtwo as well, so that's just another way of playing the deck. Let's have a look at the overall day 2 statistics then. It was 43 Lugias, so the most popular in day 2. Lost Box, Goodra did really well, especially because I think it was like only the 5th or 6th most popular deck, and ended up being the 3rd most in day 2, so its conversion was really, really strong. And I think it's obvious to see why, because it's got a good matchup into Lugia and Lost Box, which were the 2 most popular decks in day 1. So Goodra being like mildly favored into most of these builds is kind of why. Mew still doing fine. Guardy doing okay. To be honest, I think it was a big risk to take Guardy into this tournament, but some of the very best players in the world chose to play Guardy, and I think that is quite telling as to its power, but also the fact that they were willing to risk the Lost Zone matchup with their different variations is really cool, and seeing Guardy's development throughout this format is going to be quite interesting. We have a couple other interesting one counts. We of course have Sanders control, and then we have another Snorlax stall deck, which is just trying to block things, essentially. There was actually 5 Miraidons in day 2. Not many, of course, but yeah, one making top 8 as well. Kind of interesting. Arc not doing too insane, but still up here. Seriously outperforming Giratina, that's for sure. So yeah, that's the EUIC. Overall, I had an absolute blast. Commentating is always just such great fun. Ross really makes my life easy. And we had, the storylines are falling on our lap this weekend, and this is the most insane top 4 I've seen in a long time. Even like the entire top 8 is just so cracked, to be honest with you. The amount of talent we had here, and we got to see great games like throughout the entire weekend. The occasion definitely felt like a throwback to Worlds with just so many people in the room, and yeah, it was amazing. If you didn't get to check out the stream, it was phenomenal. I definitely implore you to go back and watch at least the top 8 games through to the final, because there were some nail-biters in there. And even go back and watch the juniors and seniors finals, because they were all very good players, and there were also quite close games with some interesting win conditions in there as well. Let me know your thoughts down below. I rambled a long time in depth because I had a lot of specific thoughts about these lists going into the tournament, because I was testing as if I was going to play this event, essentially, and trying to be a helpful testing partner for Complexity Card Gaming, the team that I'm part of. So I had a lot of discussion with a lot of pretty high-level players about this going into the tournament. So those are my knee-jerk reflections, and I'll be back tomorrow for another one. Cheers.